Hello again, Netrunner fans. Willing Dunn here, and I am back for the Universe of Tomorrow. This is the 6th and final data pack in the Sand cycle. As has been the case in this cycle, I'm going to be looking at the runner cards in part 1 of this video. We'll look at all the corp cards in part 2. First up is a new Anarch event. This is called Power to the People. It's 0 to play, it's 2 influence, and it's a priority, which means that you can only play it as your first click. The first time you access an agenda this turn, gain 7 credits. One of the big things I noticed looking through this pack is that there's a lot of new and really high quality, interesting designs, and this card is certainly no exception. A couple things to point out with this card. First of all, you don't actually have to steal the agenda, and there's a lot of situations, especially with the prevalence of mid-season and butcher shop, where you don't actually want to steal an agenda. So you're going to be able to imp or use film critic or just decline to pay the additional cost on an NAPD contract or something like that, and you'll still be able to satisfy this condition since you accessed the agenda. Clearly the most difficult part of making this thing work is going to be timing it around a turn where you will access an agenda, but it's worth pointing out that the Anarch faction already has some pretty good multi-access tools. That said, you don't really need to play cards to make medium better, and a lot of what you're doing prior to medium or something like that working is going to involve lots of credits. So this card is going to give you some credits after you've already set up the best thing your deck does. So that's my major reservation with this card, is that it's going to probably give you credits in a situation where you're already set up, or at least somewhat set up. It's going to be difficult to time in the early game where you need the credits the most. So it seems hard to use this as one of your primary economy options. That said, I really like this card. I think it's a really good idea, and I think if nothing else, it'll be a pretty fun and interesting card. I'm kind of iffy on it being that great, though. Next up, we have one of the definite standouts of the pack. This is Surfer. It's a new Anarch program. It's 2 to install, 1 MU, 3 influence. It has 2 credits, swap a piece of barrier ice currently being encountered with a piece of ice directly before or after it. The run continues from this new position, and you are still encountering that ice. Well, here is a really bizarre and interesting card. I think it could potentially be pretty decent as well. So the biggest thing that you can do with this is that you can move around the corporation's ice, and this might allow you to not only pass some piece of ice and not have to deal with it, but it'll also allow you to permanently rearrange them, or at least rearrange them until you surf back in. So this is definitely really good against ice that are positionally important, like ice that get bonuses if they're the outermost piece, like Curtain Wall, or ice that rely on boosting other ice, like Chum, stuff like that. The obvious limitation here is that you can only swap a barrier type. So I think that really making this card work and having it be playably good is going to be reliant on your ability to assign the barrier type to ice you're encountering. Shaper gives us a few ways to do that. We have both Tinkering, which is kind of a one-shot way to do it, and then Paintbrush, which is sort of tinkering on a stick. The big limitation with Paintbrush being that the ice already has to be rezzed. I've seen a lot of Quetzal decks that use E3 and then stuff like Overmind or maybe Faust as a way to deal with ice that they face check. This could potentially be another interesting tool for those decks. You're certainly going to have some sort of convoluted plan to make this work the way that you want it to, But that's cool, and I like that. I think that this card is maybe good enough. It's cheap to install, and its effect isn't particularly expensive either. And the ability to essentially get past a piece of ice is really, really neat. I like this card a lot. I think it'll probably see some play, and I'm hoping that it'll end up being good enough. Next up, we have another Anarch card. This is DDoS. It is a 3 to install, 3 influence virtual resource. It has trash. The corp cannot res the outermost piece of ice during a run on any server this turn. This seems pretty powerful to me. Especially early game, they're going to only have outermost ice. So that's going to make this card essentially make all of their ice unresable this turn. To me, that screams something like Vamp or Account Siphon. That's going to be really strong in the early game. This also potentially interacts well with Surfer, since you'd be able to put a new piece of ice on the outermost. That might be more the ice that you're worried about. You might have a good read on what it is. And it would also just make it more complicated and difficult for the corp to know which ice they're going to be able to res in a turn. This also has a pretty silly interaction with the card False Echo, which has generally been a pretty worthless card. But the interesting thing here is that if you run and the outermost piece is not resed, they're not going to be able to res it. They're going to have to return it to HQ, and now there's a new piece of outermost ice that they also can't res. This could also be pretty cool with Escher, which would allow you to put other ice on the outermost piece, kind of like what we were talking about with Surfer. This is also potentially pretty cool with the Cutlery or ways to destroy ice. Potentially also ways to de-res ice, like Crescentus, are pretty cool. You're going to get to generate new outermost pieces of ice that are ineligible for res, or de-res their monster thing on their outermost piece, and then be able to run through it without them being able to res it later. As cool as all the moving around ice and de-resing and destroying ice stuff is, I see this being the strongest as just letting you land siphons, but I think there's a lot of other neat interactions going on with this thing, and I just really like the design of this. Next up is the highly anticipated Laramie Fisk. He's a savvy investor. He's a new ID for criminal, 0 link, 4515 like normal. He's a natural. The first time you make a successful run on a central server each turn, you may force the corp to draw a card. Like with the ID that we're going to see on the corp side of this pack, Laramie Fisk has a special role in Netrunner's history because he was chosen by the fans. Back in late 2013, FFG ran a tournament series throughout North America called the Plugged In Tour. And the thing that made this tournament series exceptional was that the players were given a card in which they were allowed to vote on one of 2 different IDs. And the one that got the most vote would eventually be printed, and that day has come with this pack. We also saw a similar tour throughout Europe and a few other select international locations in 2014. That one was called the Chronos Protocol Tour, and we're going to see the result of the voting there in the next part of the video when we see this new Corp ID. So we've had quite a while to think about Laramie Fisk, but I don't know if that means that we've exactly figured out what to do with him. It's going to be pretty easy to satisfy his condition, since you're probably going to be able to run archives, and I think that's going to make him want to play a fairly conventional sort of rig and economy engine. I think the Desperado Data Sucker thing seems very natural with Laramie Fisk, since you're going to stack yet another thing on a successful run on a central server. So the most puzzling part of making Fisk work is going to be somehow capitalizing on the corp being forced to draw a card. Now there's a couple things that I can think of. First of all, if we flood their hand with cards, they're going to exceed their maximum hand size and potentially have to discard cards. We could also make them draw cards and hopefully hit agendas if we have easy access to HQ. Another thing that might make sense is trying to deck the corporation and run them out of cards. I'm not sure any of these strategies are really going to be better than things that we can already do with Criminal, but it's cool to get this new way to play Criminal, potentially doing some very different things than the other IDs, and I'm pretty anxious to see what people come up with this and what type of support he gets in the future. Next up, we have Fisk Investment Seminar. This is a new priority event for Criminal. It's 0 to play, 2 influence. You can play it only as your first click because it's priority. Each player draws 3 cards. This is pretty sweet. If nothing else, it's basically a diesel that you just have to play on your first click. But I think there's going to be a lot of situations where making the corp draw 3 is something that you can work out to your advantage. Especially early in the game, it seems pretty scary as the corp to have to draw 3 cards because you might hit a bunch of agendas and you don't really have protection for archives. You might not have a Jackson to shuffle them back. So you could potentially flood HQ with a bunch of agendas and not really have anywhere to put them. And of course, keep in mind that you're playing against the faction that has both HQ interface and legwork, not to mention stuff like Sneak Door Beta. This could potentially also work pretty well with multi-access effects on R&D, like multiple R&D interfaces or maybe like a medium. Now you have to play it on your first click, so you're not going to be able to run R&D, then fire this, and then rerun, but you could run on one turn, see a bunch of cards that are blank, play this at the start of your next turn, and then go in for the R&D attack. You've probably heard me say that you don't really need to play cards to make medium better, but the big thing about this is that you can include it in your deck just to draw some cards early in the game, help you find your economy, breakers, things that you need to get set up. And this is especially well suited for the early game since it costs 0. A big thing about things like Earthrise Hotel is that they set you back a ton, especially early on when you don't have a lot of credits, because you have to spend so many credits to just play it down. This is a really smart design that plays with the asymmetry of the two sides very, very well. Corp doesn't necessarily want to draw a lot of cards, especially not on its own terms, and this card is going to both help you get set up and do some nice things for you as the runner, while also potentially being an offensive card against the Corp. Next up, we have a new piece of hardware for Shaper. This is called Bookmark. It's 0 to play, 2 influence. It has click, host up to 3 cards from your grip, face down on Bookmark. You can look at those anytime. Thank you. Click or trash, add all cards on Bookmark to your grip. I don't know if this card's really that great, but I definitely see a lot of cool things you can do with it. First of all, it interacts really well with the Shaper draw effects that draw us a ton of cards. So we obviously have Diesel, but we also have things like Quality Time and Game Day. Both of these draw us a lot of cards, and a lot of times we have to discard some of those cards because our maximum hand size is too small. Hosting them on Bookmark is a way that we could not only avoid having to discard these cards, but we can also choose and save select cards for later so that we're not worried about losing them to net or meat damage before we get to use them. Speaking of meat damage, this might also be an interesting way to shore up our defenses against things like Scorched Earth and Traffic Accident. We can host a bunch of cards on this, and then when they go to tag us, we can fire the trash effect and add a bunch of cards to our grip so that we don't flatline to potential meat damage effects. I'm not sure if this will end up being good enough, but it might be a cool alternative to playing something like Plascrete in your deck, and I think this is just another clever design. Next up, we have a new Shaper program called the Vinci. This is a 1 to install 1MU program, 2 influence. Whenever you make a successful run, place 1 power counter on it, trash, install a card from your grip with an install cost equal to or less than the number of power counters on it, ignoring the install cost. Here's another really sweet design that has a lot of cool things going on with it. First of all, this is going to trigger unsuccessful runs, so it potentially stacks with a bunch of the other successful run stuff we're doing, like Desperado and Data Sucker, maybe security testing, a bunch of other economy engines that already work well. The thing I'm most excited about with this is that it allows you to install cards of any type, and you can potentially do that on the corporation's turn, since you can do it during a paid ability window. There's a lot of things that get nastier if the corp can't anticipate them, especially things that trigger when the corp scores, or maybe things that interact with flatline effects like damage prevention or tag prevention effects. But you can also just use this as a pseudo economy card to let you install your big things like consoles, Earthrise Hotel, or maybe just breakers without having to pay for them. I really like this card. I think it's going to see a little bit of play. I think it's going to work best if you have other successful run-oriented stuff going on with your economy, so I could see maybe some criminals wanting to play something like this. Another very cool and reasonably versatile design. The last runner card in the pack is neutral. It's called Wireless Net Pavilion. It's 1 to install, no influence. It's a resource location. As an additional cost to spend a click to trash a resource, the corp must pay 2 credits. Well, here's a pretty specialized tool that maybe at first glance seems kind of bad, but I think that it's going to have a really good and specific use with combination of a few other cards. In my old Hollywood review, I talked about using paparazzi with data leak reversal as a way that you would potentially not have to actually be tagged in order to take benefit of data leak reversal's ability. But a big weakness of that concept is that the corp can just pay to trash your stuff. So like best case scenario, you're going to install paparazzi and then mill 3 cards. And that's really just not that great. This Wireless Net Pavilion gives us a way to potentially tax the corp more or make it harder for them to just trash altogether. If you have multiples of this in play, you could stack up the cost to trash your resources to very, very high numbers, and you could potentially also use something like Fall Guy to protect the resources even further. So this seems like an emerging archetype to me, where you're able to set up this sort of combo and then be able to mill a bunch of corporation cards. And once you get the whole engine kind of together, you don't even really need to make runs to win the game. I'm not totally sure how to feel about this, but I do think that it's good that we're finally getting a truly passive way to play runner. I think Noise has been the closest to that we've had so far, and I think it's fair to say that there's been several failed experiments with that sort of thing. I'm looking at Ian Sterling. That's going to do it for part 1 of my Universe of Tomorrow review. Make sure you tune into part 2 where we're going to look at the corp cards in the pack, and if you liked the video, please click subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up. I'll see you over in part 2.